A single woman denied a flight next day. She becomes the CEO of an airline. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day for Sarah Matthews, but little did she know it would become a turning point in her life. Sarah, a successful business consultant, had spent the past few months preparing for her upcoming meeting with a major client in New York. The stakes were high, and this trip was crucial for her career. Everything depended on it. She had worked tirelessly to secure this opportunity and had every intention of making it. On the day of her flight, she arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare. Her flight was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., and it was barely 8:45 a.m. when she walked through the security gates, confident and ready. She moved briskly through the terminal, her mind focused on the upcoming pitch. She was wearing a tailored black suit, her signature look that exuded professionalism and confidence. The air was cool inside the terminal, and the faint hum of announcements and conversation surrounded her. Everything felt normal. There was no reason to believe that anything would go wrong. Sarah's steps quickened as she approached the gate. She glanced at the clock on the wall. There was still more than enough time for her to check in, get her boarding pass, and head to the gate. She saw the line at the counter was relatively short, so she moved toward it, ready to be on her way. But as she stood in line, she felt an unsettling chill. The woman at the counter, a young airline agent, was staring at her with a cold, unfazed expression. When it was her turn, Sarah stepped forward, her heart still racing with anticipation of the upcoming meeting. "Good morning," Sarah said politely, smiling as she handed the agent her ID and ticket. "I'm all set for my flight to New York." The agent didn't respond with a greeting or a smile. Instead, she scanned the ticket and glanced up at Sarah, her face betraying nothing. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You've missed your flight," the agent said flatly, almost robotic. Sarah blinked, confused. "I haven't. My flight doesn't depart for another 20 minutes. It's only 8:50 a.m. The agent's eyes remained cold as she looked down at her screen. "Your boarding time has passed. You are not allowed to board." Her tone was firm and final. Sarah's pulse quickened. There was no way this was happening. She double-checked her watch and then her boarding pass. Everything was in order. Her flight was still on schedule, and there was no reason for her to be denied boarding. "I've been here well before the departure time," she said, trying to maintain control. "Please, I need to get on this flight. This meeting is incredibly important." The agent didn't flinch. "Sorry, there's nothing I can do. The gate is closed now." The words felt like a slap in the face, each syllable carrying more indifference than the last. Sarah's frustration began to mount, but she tried to remain calm. "Can you check with your supervisor, please? I'm sure there's a mistake." The agent, still unmoved, simply shook her head. "I've already checked. You're too late." Her mind raced. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a major setback. The meeting she had been preparing for was hours away, and without this flight, she would miss it completely. Time was ticking, and Sarah could feel the pressure building with every second. "I need to speak to someone higher up," she demanded. Her voice, though calm, carried an edge of urgency. The agent motioned toward the side of the counter without offering any further assistance. Sarah's frustration bubbled over, but she had no choice but to walk over to the side. She knew there were no guarantees, but she couldn't simply accept defeat, not yet. She watched as passengers continued to file past her, heading toward the gate without a care in the world, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. After a few minutes, another airline employee arrived at the counter, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a black uniform. He briefly looked at Sarah's boarding pass and then shook his head. "Sorry, miss, but the gate is closed. We can't let you through. You've missed your flight." His voice was just as indifferent as the agent's, and his eyes were devoid of any empathy. Sarah's heart raced. She felt the rising tide of frustration threatening to overwhelm her. This wasn't fair. She had done everything right, arrived on time, followed the procedure, and yet here she was, being treated like an afterthought. She couldn't fathom how they could be so dismissive, so cold. She tried to argue her case once more, explaining how she had arrived early, how the flight wasn't due to leave for another 20 minutes. But the man's expression never changed. He repeated the same lines. "There's nothing we can do. You've missed your flight." The more she spoke, the less anyone seemed to care. No one looked at her as an individual, a customer who had entrusted the airline with her business. To them, she was just another inconvenience. The sense of helplessness began to settle in. The weight of the situation hit her hard. She wasn't just missing a flight. She was missing a chance to prove herself, to move forward in her career, to secure a deal that could change everything. It felt like the universe was conspiring against her. She had put so much effort into this moment, and now it was slipping away out of her control. Frustration boiled into anger. How could they do this? How could they ignore the importance of a single passenger? Sarah looked around the terminal, trying to steady herself. Her thoughts swirled in a mix of disbelief, humiliation, and fury. She knew that this was more than just a mistake. It was a failure of service, a failure of the airline to respect its passengers. But most of all, it was a moment where she was made to feel powerless, and that was the most infuriating part of it all. As she stood there, processing the situation, an unfamiliar emotion gripped her, a quiet sense of resolve. She had always been a woman who fought for what she believed in. Her career had been built on overcoming obstacles, on turning setbacks into opportunities. This time wouldn't be any different. This wasn't just about missing a flight. This was about making sure that no one else would ever feel the way she did in that moment. With a spark of determination igniting deep within her, Sarah made a decision. She would not let this stand. She would not let the airline get away with treating its passengers like this. And she would make sure that they would never again overlook someone as insignificant as herself. She didn't know it yet, but this seemingly trivial incident, this denial of a single flight, would set in motion a series of events that would change her life forever. Sarah Matthews walked out of that airport terminal with her shoulders back and her jaw clenched, not in defeat, but in thought. The ache of what had just happened still lingered, raw and personal, but it wasn't the kind of pain that left her helpless. It was the kind that sharpened a person. She didn't scream or cry or post angry rants online like many would have. That just wasn't her style. She had been built in boardrooms, not on stages. The disappointment she felt wasn't about a missed flight. It was about being dismissed, dehumanized, treated like an error in a system instead of a paying customer with dignity. She had seen enough broken systems in her line of work to know when something deeper was wrong. And this airline, this culture, it reeked of something rotten at the core. She went home, sat at her kitchen table, and opened a fresh page in her notebook. The city outside was wide awake, horns blaring, lights blinking in rhythm, life rushing forward. But inside her apartment, it was silent, still. She stared at that blank page and without hesitation wrote at the top in bold letters, "People before protocol." Underneath that heading, she began to write, almost feverishly, jotting down everything she had noticed. Not just about her experience, but what it reflected about the company. She thought like a strategist because that's who she was. For over a decade, Sarah had worked with mid-sized firms and Fortune 500 companies alike, helping them navigate mergers, reverse declining profits, and rebuild their brand reputations. She had never aimed for the spotlight. She preferred being the silent mind behind big turnarounds. But tonight, for the first time, she realized she didn't want to just help from the outside. She wanted to fix it herself, from within. That night, sleep never came. Her desk became a war room. She didn't just list what had gone wrong, she mapped it. The poor training of staff, the over-reliance on rigid policies, the absence of escalation protocols, the robotic customer service mindset, and most importantly, the complete lack of emotional intelligence at the customer touchpoints. She paired each issue with a solution, scalable, cost-effective, and human-centric. It was a blueprint not just for fixing an airline, but for rebuilding its soul. By morning, she wasn't tired. She was more alive than she'd felt in years. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't dialed in nearly 2 years, Charles Grayson. Charles had once been the CEO of a tech company she'd helped turn around. They had built a strong mutual respect, though they'd drifted since he transitioned into corporate advisory roles. What many didn't know was that Charles now sat on the board of the very airline that had shut its doors in her face. She didn't hesitate. She tapped the call button. "Sarah?" Charles answered, surprised. "Charles," she said, calm but firm, "I need 10 minutes, not to complain, to propose a solution. I had a run-in with your airline yesterday, and I believe what happened to me is happening to a lot of people. I also believe I know how to fix it. She heard silence on the other end, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant disinterest. It was the kind that came from a man leaning back in his chair, eyes narrowing, curious. "I'm listening," he said. Over the next 15 minutes, Sarah unpacked the experience, not with emotion, but with clarity. She didn't talk about being wronged. She talked about operational breakdowns, cultural decay, and the long-term damage being done to customer loyalty. She spoke about how the airline had turned into a cold machine, one that didn't just ignore people, it erased them. And then she laid out her plan: retraining programs, structural reforms, customer empathy models, incentive changes for frontline workers, and a bold rebranding strategy that would reposition the airline as a people-first company in an industry starved for warmth. By the time she finished, Charles let out a low whistle. "That," he said, "is not a complaint. That's a corporate diagnosis, and a damn good one." Sarah didn't smile. "I didn't call for applause. I want to present this to your board. And more than that, I want to be part of implementing it. Not as a consultant, as a leader." He paused, then said, "You know what you're asking, right?" "I do," she replied. "I'm asking for the chance to change the same system that failed me, and countless others." 2 days later, she was flown to the airline's headquarters, ironically in first class, with a concierge escort and more attention than she'd ever received from the company before. She noticed it, of course, but didn't react. They weren't treating her this way because they'd learned their lesson. They were doing it because they were nervous. She was no longer just a passenger. She was now someone the board was willing to hear out. As she walked into the boardroom, every eye turned to her. These were veteran executives, industry veterans, shareholders, legal minds, and marketing chiefs. Men and women who had led companies through turbulence far greater than a missed flight. And yet none of them expected to be challenged by a woman they had never heard of until 3 days ago. She stood at the head of the table, opened her folder, and began. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but unwavering. She didn't try to impress them with jargon. She told a story, her story, then she transitioned into the systems behind it. "You think you have an operational problem," she said at one point, "but what you really have is a cultural blindness. You've forgotten what business you're in. You think it's logistics, but it's trust. You move people, not packages. And when people feel disrespected, they don't just walk away. They talk. Loudly." Slides followed. Data backed her points. Solutions were offered, each connected to a direct cost-saving or brand-building benefit. She spoke for 45 minutes straight without notes, her entire argument flowing like a river that had been waiting for this moment to crash through a dam. By the end of her pitch, there was silence again. But this time, it wasn't skeptical. It was stunned. The same senior board member who had barely looked up from his tablet earlier now leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I don't know what your end game is, Ms. Matthew," he said, "but I haven't heard a more clear-headed plan for this company in years." She didn't miss a beat. "My end game," she said, "is not to fix your company from the sidelines. It's to lead it. Because if you want change, real change, you don't need another voice giving you advice. You need someone who's lived the failure and still believes in what it could become." A hush fell over the room. Some board members looked at one another. Others stared at her, visibly reconsidering everything they had assumed about her. Charles, seated at the far end, broke the silence. "I think the real question is, do we want another executive who's never spoken to a customer in years, or someone who understands what being one actually feels like?" The board meeting ended without an official vote, but the energy in the room had shifted. She had arrived a stranger, a former customer with a complaint, but now she was a contender. And though no one said it out loud, the whispers had already begun to stir beneath the surface. What if she's exactly what we need? 2 weeks passed. Sarah returned to her normal rhythm, or at least tried to. She continued working with her private clients while keeping a polite but firm distance from any assumptions about what would happen next. She didn't chase updates from the board. She knew enough about power to understand that real decisions didn't happen in a rush. They brewed in silence, discussed behind closed doors by men and women who measured risk in decimal points. But quietly under the surface, conversations were shifting. Board members who once brushed off customer experiences as PR problems were now re-examining their models. Senior executives were calling emergency meetings. HR teams began whispering about upcoming audits on internal training systems. Sarah's presentation had left an imprint, not just on their strategies, but on their conscience. Then early on a Tuesday morning, Sarah's phone rang. It was Charles. His voice was calm, steady, but his words landed like thunder. "They're ready, Sarah. They want you, but it won't be easy." Sarah sat upright in her chair. "What does that mean?" "They're offering you the position, but not quietly. It's going to be public, bold. They want to make a statement to their shareholders, to the media, to their customers, that this airline is turning the page. You're the symbol of that page." Her breath caught for a moment. It was surreal. Just over 2 weeks ago, she was being denied a seat like she didn't matter. And now she was being offered the very helm of the company that had once shut her out. "What's the catch?" she asked. "They're expecting results. Fast. The culture is entrenched. Some executives won't like answering to an outsider, let alone one who got in through what they see as a fluke. But the board is united. You have full authority." The Friday, the news broke. Headlines buzzed across the business world. Sarah Matthews appointed CEO of Skyline Air following customer experience scandal. The story made rounds in aviation circles, corporate journals, and leadership columns. Not because of the scandal, but because of the shocking pivot. For the first time in years, the appointment of a new CEO wasn't about legacy or seniority. It was about relevance, and Sarah embodied it. At her first press conference, Sarah stepped onto the stage wearing a crisp navy blue suit, no frills, no flash, just clarity and purpose. Cameras clicked as she stood behind the podium, composed and unapologetically direct. "I'm not here to manage appearances," she began. "I'm here to rebuild trust. I wasn't hired to protect the old way of doing things. I was hired because the old way failed, and because I believe there's a better way forward, one where passengers are treated like people, not problems." What followed wasn't just lip service. In her first 100 days, Sarah led an overhaul of frontline training programs across the country. She personally visited 12 airport hubs, sat in employee briefings, and listened, not to executives, but to gate agents, check-in clerks, call center reps. She wanted to hear the pain points from the people living them, and when she did, she acted. She eliminated rigid penalties for staff who showed discretion in helping passengers. She installed a new escalation team, empowered to resolve passenger disputes with empathy, not scripts. She introduced an internal recognition program that rewarded staff not for speed, but for kindness and problem-solving. She didn't just talk about empathy, she operationalized it. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Some executives resisted her reforms, calling them soft, unnecessary, even risky. One senior vice president tried to undercut her initiatives in private memos, pushing for a return to proven systems. Sarah discovered the attempt within days. She didn't lash out. Instead, she invited the man to a closed-door meeting, laid out the metrics that showed growing customer satisfaction scores and retention rates, and offered him a choice: adapt or step aside. Within a week, he resigned. The media followed her journey closely, but Sarah never chased attention. What she chased was consistency. Her policies were data-backed, but people first. She didn't push slogans. She pushed accountability. And slowly, public perception began to shift. Flyers who had once sworn off the airline began returning. Customer service call times dropped. Positive reviews climbed. Employees started speaking publicly about a new spirit in the workplace. Then came the real turning point. 3 months into her tenure, Sarah held a company-wide town hall that was streamed live to every department across the country. She stood on a modest stage at a training center near Dallas, wearing a simple black blouse and gray slacks. No teleprompter, just her and the people. She told the full story of what had happened to her at the airport. She spoke plainly, without blame, and then said something that left the room in complete silence. "I wasn't angry that day because I missed a flight. I was angry because no one looked me in the eye and saw a person. That's what we're fixing. not with slogans but with action. Every passenger who walks through our gates deserves dignity. And every one of you, our team, deserves to work in a company where empathy isn't optional. It's standard. The applause didn't come right away, but when it did, it was thunderous. Employees across divisions, from janitors to senior staff, began to stand, one by one. It wasn't just respect, it was belief. For the first time in years, they felt like they were part of something that mattered again. By the end of her first year, Skyline Air had seen its highest customer satisfaction ratings in over a decade. Flight delays dropped, employee retention climbed, but more importantly, people, both inside and outside the company, believed in the brand again. All of it because one woman refused to let her mistreatment be the end of her story. She didn't just get on the flight, she took the cockpit. And from that moment on, Skyline Air wasn't just an airline. It was the airline that had dared to be led by someone who once stood alone at a gate, denied and forgotten, and had turned that moment into a movement.